Marry the plain one and settle the account, her father said. The Duke of Ashbourne did not expect to keep her forever. A story narrated by Edmund Calloway, Duke of Ashbourne. Part 1. The account. I will tell you what I told my steward the morning she arrived. I told him to prepare the East Wing guest room, not the Duchess' suite, the guest room, because I did not intend for this to be anything more than a legal arrangement, and I saw no reason to pretend otherwise. I told him to inform the kitchens that there would be one additional person at table, and to adjust the household accounts accordingly. I told him, and I can hear the words still, cold as November stone, she is the settlement of a debt. Treat her with the courtesy you would extend to any guest, and do not trouble me about her unless something requires my attention. That is what I said. I was, as it happens, wrong about nearly everything, but I did not know that yet. Let me explain the arrangement because it matters. Thomas Hartley was a gentleman of modest inheritance and catastrophic instincts. He loved cards the way other men love their children, fiercely, blindly, and to spectacular ruin. He had, in the course of 15 years, worked through the better part of what his own father had left him: a house in Wiltshire, 100 acres of moderate farmland, and a reputation that had once been perfectly respectable, and was now the subject of the kind of careful silence that well-bred people deploy when they wish to convey contempt without the vulgarity of expressing it directly. By the autumn of 1817, he owed the Ashbourne estate £11,000. £11,000 was, for Hartley, an impossible sum. He had no land left to sell, no credit left to extend, and 3 daughters, the eldest 2 engaged to men of sufficient means, the youngest not. The youngest was Eleanor Hartley. She had reached the age of 25 without attracting a serious offer, a fact her father attributed to her plainness and her habit of saying what she thought. She had made herself useful in the Hartley household in the way that women of intelligence and no particular vanity sometimes do, managing the accounts her father refused to look at, keeping the household running on a fraction of what it needed while he continued to lose at cards. She had done all of this without complaint and without recognition, and without the expectation of either. I would come to see this clearly, but not yet. My solicitor brought me the offer. Hartley would sign over the remaining lease on his house in Wiltshire, worth perhaps £3,000, and give me the hand of his youngest daughter in marriage, in full and final settlement of all debts. My solicitor delivered this with the kind of neutral face a man cultivates over a long career of delivering uncomfortable information. He waited for me to laugh. I did not laugh. I had been considering marriage for some time. In the abstract and businesslike way I considered everything. I needed an heir. I needed someone to manage the household in the increasingly chaotic way that Ashbourne Hall required managing. My previous housekeeper had retired, and her replacement was competent but not exceptional, and the estate had developed a certain entropy that I could feel but could not seem to address, being neither domestic nor patient enough to address it myself. I did not need beauty. I did not need a woman who could dance or play the pianoforte or charm, a drawing room full of people whose opinions I did not particularly value. I did not, at that time, believe I needed anything from a wife beyond competence and discretion. "What is she like?" I asked my solicitor. He consulted his notes with an expression I can now read as poorly suppressed doubt. "Plain spoken," he said. "Educated not fashionably, practical. Her father describes her as difficult." He paused. "He also says she is the only one of his daughters who can read a ledger." "Done," I said. And that was that. A letter was sent. A contract was drawn up. The terms were straightforward. The debt was cleared, the house in Wiltshire was deeded to the estate, and Miss Eleanor Hartley became, by legal arrangement, the future Duchess of Ashbourne. I did not meet her before the contract was signed. This was, I was told by my solicitor, unusual. I said that I had read the terms and they were satisfactory, and that I saw no reason to involve sentiment in a business matter. He did not argue. He had stopped arguing with me about things like that some years before. In the first week of October, Nell, as I would learn she was called, though her father's letter referred to her throughout as a leaner, with a formality that struck me even then as the particular coldness of a man handing away something he never valued, Nell packed one trunk. One trunk, I was told later. She had been offered the use of a second, and she had declined, saying she preferred to take only what she would actually use. She bid farewell to the house her father was about to lose anyway, and was delivered to Ashbourne Hall in a hired carriage on a gray Tuesday morning in October. I did not go to the door to meet her. I told myself this was appropriate. This was not a romance. This was a settlement. The courtesy of the household would stand in for the courtesy I did not particularly wish to extend, not because I bore her any ill will, but because I had organized my life along the principle that warmth, extended without cause, was a form of dishonesty. I did not know her. There was no cause yet. My housekeeper, Mrs. Aldgate, met her at the door instead. Mrs. Aldgate had been at Ashbourne Hall for 23 years and had served my mother and my father, and now me with equal competence and somewhat varying degrees of approval. She told me about the arrival that evening, in the careful way she had of delivering information she thought I needed without quite saying so directly. She said she came in without hesitation, Your Grace. No tears, no fuss. She looked at the entrance hall, you know how people do when they see the hall for the first time, the ceilings and the staircase and the gallery, and she said, The plasterwork above the east window is cracking. You'll want someone to look at that before winter. Mrs. Aldgate paused. I thought, she added, that you ought to know. Thank you, I said. I sent someone to look at the plasterwork that afternoon. It was indeed cracking. I met Nell Hartley at dinner that evening. I had, by that point, instructed the footman to lay the table in the smaller dining room. The great dining room was absurd for two people, and I had made what I considered to be an appropriate effort, which is to say I had changed my coat and arrived on time. She was seated across the table from me in a gown of dark blue wool that had been well made some years ago and was now simply well kept. Her hair was brown and arranged neatly, with no particular artistry. Her face was, my solicitor had been accurate, not remarkable by any conventional measure. She was neither ugly nor beautiful. She had clear gray eyes, a straight nose, and a mouth set in a line that suggested she was accustomed to making the best of things and had become reasonably good at it. She said good evening. She asked if I preferred to eat in silence or to converse. I said I generally preferred silence. She said, as you like, and applied herself to the soup with the composure of someone who has decided there is no point in being unsettled by things one cannot change. Halfway through the first course she looked up and said, with no particular inflection, as though this were merely continuing a conversation we had already been having, Your drainage on the south tenancy is failing. I spoke with one of your stable lads this afternoon when I was walking the grounds. He says 3 of your tenant families have been dealing with flooded cellars since August. I thought you ought to know, if you didn't already. I set down my fork. I looked at her. I didn't know, I said. She looked back at her soup. Your steward may have forgotten to mention it. I sent for my steward the following morning. He had not forgotten to mention it. He had decided, in the way that long-tenured servants sometimes decide things, that it was not the kind of problem I wished to be troubled with. He had been managing it himself, which is to say he had been not managing it at all and hoping it would resolve, which is the administrative equivalent of closing one's eyes to a problem and calling it solved. It had not resolved. 3 families had been living with flooding since August, and it was now October, and no one had thought to tell the Duke. I authorized the repairs and said nothing further about it to my steward, who was visibly relieved. But I found myself, that evening, thinking about gray eyes and a straight nose and the particular quality of a woman who arrived in a stranger's house with one trunk and spent her first afternoon talking to the stable lads about drainage. It was not, I thought, what I had expected. I did not yet know that this would be the pattern. She would consistently and quietly exceed what I had expected, until I stopped expecting and started simply paying attention. Part 2: The Harvest. October at Ashbourne is beautiful if you are the kind of person who can afford to find it beautiful. The park turns gold and amber, the home wood goes dark with leaf fall, the tenant fields go tawny with harvest, and the whole estate smells of cut grain and cold air, and the particular industry of a place that knows winter is coming. In the evenings the light comes low and golden through the western windows of the hall. I was not, that October, paying enough attention to any of it, but I was starting to. We had the blight in the second week. It came quiet and catastrophic as these things do. A fungal rot that moved through the rye like a rumor, south edge first, then spreading inward. By the time my farm manager identified it, a third of the tenant crop was gone. By the time I was informed, not by my farm manager but by Nell at dinner, who had been walking the tenant fields and had already spoken with him herself, it was closer to half. The Crenshaw family and the Mossfield family are worst hit, she said, in the same even tone she used for everything, a tone I had come to recognize as not coldness, but the voice of a woman who has decided that clarity is more useful than distress. The Crenshaw holding is on the south edge, which was first affected. Mr. Crenshaw has 3 children under 6 and his wife is expecting again in December. The Mossfields are elderly. They have no children at home, no secondary income, and the field loss will take their winter reserves down to almost nothing. I set down my fork. I will instruct the estate to compensate them from the reserves. The compensation will take weeks to arrange through the estate accounts. She looked at me steadily across the candle-lit table. They need to eat now, and the children need adequate warmth in November. I opened my mouth. She continued, which I was beginning to understand was simply how she operated. I have spoken with Mrs. Aldgate about the kitchen stores. We have surplus preserves from the summer and a considerable quantity of grain that the hall will not use before it spoils. If you authorize it, I would like to take a portion of the stores to the affected families tomorrow morning. I've already identified which families and approximately what each household needs. There was a silence. I was not accustomed to being organized. I was accustomed to being obeyed. I gave instructions and they were carried out, and this was the order of things at Ashbourne Hall, and it had seemed to me adequate. What I was not accustomed to was someone arriving at my table with not only the problem but the solution and the logistics already worked out, presented without request for praise or permission, simply as, "Here is what is needed, will you allow it?" "You may take whatever the kitchens can spare," I said. She nodded once, "Thank you." She was gone before 7 the following morning. I learned this from Mrs. Aldgate, who informed me over the course of my breakfast. She had taken to hovering at dinner and breakfast in a way that was not quite hovering, more a sort of attentive proximity, that Miss Hartley had been up since 5, had inventoried the surplus with remarkable efficiency, had organized the loading of 2 estate carts with characteristic precision, and had set off down the South Road in the company of 2 footmen and the estate's oldest cart horse, who was, apparently, the gentlest animal on the property, and the one she had specifically requested. I told myself I had other business. I had correspondence to attend to, a backlog of estate correspondence that had accumulated over the summer with the reliable productivity of all things I was avoiding. I had a meeting with my solicitor about the winter quarter rents and the outstanding question of the mill lease. I had any number of legitimate demands on my morning that did not involve riding south. By 9 o'clock I had left the solicitor's meeting, saddled my own horse, and ridden south without being entirely clear about why. I found her in the Crenshaw yard. The flooding I had heard about abstractly was real and present and considerably worse than I had imagined. The yard stood in 2 inches of standing water. The blocked drainage channel along the near wall was visible even from the gate, silted, overgrown, packed solid with 2 seasons of neglect. It should have been cleared in the spring. It had not been cleared. And so it sat, turning the Crenshaw yard into a shallow lake while 3 children under 6 lived in that house, and their mother, 7 months along, carried water from the high well because the lower cistern was submerged. Nell was in the yard. She was in the yard to her ankles in that water, her skirts knotted up out of the way in a fashion that would have horrified every woman of her acquaintance, directing one of my footmen in the use of a long-handled shovel to break the silt at the channel's mouth. She had her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She was covered in mud from the channel work, and she had apparently not noticed or decided not to care. She was talking at the same time to the eldest Crenshaw child, a boy of perhaps 5, standing in the doorway of the cottage watching the proceedings with the solemn interest of small children confronted with unexpected adults, in the calm, cheerful way of someone who finds nothing unusual about standing in someone's flooded yard on a cold October morning, and who is simultaneously giving instructions and holding a conversation with a 5-year-old about the relative merits of different types of mud. She looked up when she heard my horse. There was a beat of silence. She looked at me. I looked at her. I looked at the blocked channel, at the flooded yard, at the footman wielding a shovel with more enthusiasm than skill, at the Crenshaw boy in the doorway, at the gray sky above us. I dismounted. I took the shovel from the footman. I do not know exactly why I did it. I am the Duke of Ashbourne. I have staff for this, men whose specific employment it is to dig channels and clear blockages and manage the 10,000 practical problems of a working estate. But she was standing in that water with her sleeves rolled up and her skirts knotted, and she was not asking me for anything. Not for help, not for notice, not for approval, and something about the not asking, the simple thorough getting on with it, made me want, quite fiercely, to be useful, to be present in the way she was present. The channel took the better part of 2 hours to clear properly. The work was harder than I had expected. The silt was compacted, the matting of grass thick, and there were 2 large stones that had settled into the channel mouth over the summer that had to be levered out by hand before the water could move at all. By the time the channel began to flow freely and the yard started to drain, my coat was beyond recovery, and I had mud to my knees, and the Crenshaw boy had abandoned the doorway and was standing 2 feet away from me, watching with the absorbed attention of someone observing a very important experiment. "You're the Duke," he said at one point. "I am," I said. He considered this. "You're digging." "I am," I said. He seemed to find this satisfactory and said nothing further. Nell was delivering the stores from the cart by the time the yard was half drained, working with Mrs. Crenshaw to stack the preserves and grain in the dry upper room, talking with her about the winter provisions and the December confinement in that direct, practical way she had, not kind in the soft-spoken sentimental way, but kind in the more durable sense, the kind that asks what is actually needed and then tries to supply it. By the time I had finished with the channel, Mrs. Crenshaw had produced cups of very bad tea from somewhere, and was pressing them on everyone within reach, and Nell was sitting on an upturned crate in the newly draining yard, talking with the Crenshaw boy about horses, and I stood with my shovel and my ruined coat, and mud to my knees, feeling something I could not immediately name. It was not until we rode back together. She had accepted the use of one of the estate horses, a quiet gray mare she handled well, and the 2 of us rode side by side along the South Road in the thin October afternoon light, that she said anything to me directly. We had ridden in silence for perhaps a 1/4 mile, a companionable silence quite different from the preferred silence of the dinner table, when she said, without looking at me, "Thank you for coming." "I had nothing else pressing," I said, which was not true, and I think we both knew it. She looked at me then briefly with those clear gray eyes. "No," she said, with the faint suggestion of a smile, "I didn't think you did." And she rode ahead, and I watched her ride in the thin October light, with her mud-stained skirts and her neat hair and her competent hands on the mare's reins, and I thought something I had not thought before and did not yet know how to say. I thought I have been a fool about a number of things. Part 3. The fever. It was the youngest Mossfield grandchild who fell sick first. The elderly Mossfield couple had taken in 2 of their grandchildren the previous spring when their son died, a boy of 6 and a girl of 3, left without a father. The Mossfields had simply taken them in without ceremony or fuss, the way people do when there is no alternative. They were good people. They did not complain. The girl fell sick first. A high fever, coming on quickly in the 3rd week of October, and by the following day it had spread to her brother. By the day after, Mrs. Mossfield herself was ill. Nell went to them. She went without asking. She simply did not appear at breakfast on the morning after she received the news word had come from the village in the evening. And Mrs. Aldgate informed me, with the expression of a woman who is not sure whether she is reporting or endorsing, that Miss Hartley had gone to the Mossfield cottage at first light, and had sent a message to the estate physician asking him to attend at his earliest convenience. I told her to instruct Dr. Carver to do whatever Miss Hartley required and bill the estate. Dr. Carver, a capable if habitually nervous man who had been the Ashbourne estate physician for 12 years, and who I had mostly encountered when I was ill myself, and found him hovering in a way I found unnerving, came to me in some agitation that afternoon to say that Miss Hartley had already organized the sick room with considerable skill when he arrived, had identified which of the children was most unwell, and which the elder Mrs. Mossfield needed watching most carefully, and had, in his carefully chosen words, a rather complete grasp of the situation. He seemed simultaneously impressed and confused about how to feel about it. "Good," I said. "Continue to attend as needed." He left. I sat in my study. That evening, Nell did not come to dinner. The table was set for 2, and 1 chair was empty, and the footman informed me quietly that Miss Hartley had sent word she would take her evening meal at the Mossfield cottage. I ate alone. The dining room was very quiet. She did not come to dinner the following evening either, or the one after that. On the first evening I told myself it was of no consequence. She was doing what needed doing and the household continued without interruption, and there was no reason for her absence to register as anything beyond an administrative note. On the second evening I found myself eating in silence, actual silence, the empty, wrong silence of a room from which something has been subtracted, and I set down my fork halfway through the first course and told myself to continue eating and did not. On the third evening I sat across from the empty chair, and I thought about the fact that for 3 weeks I had said I preferred silence and had not known, until now, what I was preferring it to. At some point near 10 o'clock I put on my coat and told myself I was going for a walk on the estate. This was almost never something I did at 10 o'clock in the evening in October. I walked south, which is to say, I walked directly toward the Mossfield cottage without examining this decision too carefully. There was a light under the door. I could hear, faintly, the sound of a child coughing, not the racking, frightening cough of worsening sickness, but the lighter, clearing cough of someone beginning to recover. I stood in the cold dark outside that door and I thought about knocking, and then I thought about what I would say if I knocked, and I could not find an answer. I was the Duke of Ashbourne. I had walked a mile in the dark to stand outside a tenant cottage, and I had no explanation for myself. I sat down on the stone step and I waited. She found me there at 3:30 in the morning. The door opened, and she stood in the lamplight of the doorway with her sleeves still rolled and her hair escaping its arrangement, looking more tired than I had seen anyone look who was still upright, and she stopped when she saw me and stood there for a moment. "The children are better," she said. "The fever broke an hour ago. Mrs. Mossfield is still unwell but not dangerously so. Dr. Carver will come in the morning." "Good," I said. I was still sitting on the step. I made no move to get up. She looked at me for a moment. "You've been here for some time," she said. A while, I said. Edmund, she had not called me that before. She had not called me anything. She used it without apparent self-consciousness, simply because it was my name. Why? I looked at the dark field beyond the cottage garden. The stars were very clear and cold. I wanted to know they were all right, I said. This was true and not complete, and I think she understood it was not complete, and she did not press. She came and sat down on the step beside me. There was a foot of cold stone between us, but she sat beside me on the step outside the cottage in the dark, and I find I am still grateful for this. 11 years later, with a warmth that has not diminished, I was glad she stayed. We sat in silence for a little while. The field was dark and the stars were clear, and the October cold settled around us both. When I was 12, she said eventually, her voice quiet, not looking at me, my mother was ill for nearly a year, a lung complaint. There were months when we didn't know if she would recover. I used to sit outside her door at night. My father told me it was morbid. My elder sisters told me I was being strange. She paused. I thought it was the only thing that made sense. If someone you care about is suffering, you want to be close. Even if there's nothing you can do, the closeness itself is something. I thought about this. Your mother recovered, I said. She did, a pause. She died 5 years later of something else entirely, but she recovered from the lung complaint. She looked at the field. I'm very glad she did. We had 5 good years. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which she seemed to understand. After a moment she said, "Why did you agree to this arrangement?" Direct as always, I considered deflecting. I had deflected questions my entire life. It was one of the things the most feared Duke reputation was useful for. People did not ask direct questions of men they were afraid of. She was not afraid of me. She had not been afraid of me for a single day since she arrived. Because I needed a wife, I said, and I do not believe in romance. She was quiet. Or I did not, I said. She turned her head and looked at me in the dark with a look I could not quite read in the starlight. Did not, she repeated softly, not a question, an observation. She was noting the tense. She was always noting things. She stood. She brushed the cold from her skirts. She looked down at me for a moment in the October dark. You should go back, she said. It's freezing. So should you. I'm going back inside. She looked at me for one moment more, and her expression was, I have thought about it many times in the years since, and the only word I can find is careful. She was looking at me carefully, the way you look at something fragile that you have begun to value. Thank you for being here, she said, even on the step. She went back inside, the door closed, the light stayed on beneath it. I walked home through the dark fields, and I walked slowly, and I thought about the tent she had noticed. I did not believe in romance, did not, and I thought about a woman who sat outside her mother's door at 12 years old because closeness itself was something. And I thought that I was, in all probability, in a great deal more trouble than I had bargained for when I had told my solicitor done, across a business meeting table. Part 4, the library. She came back to the hall on the 4th day. The children had recovered, Mrs. Mossfield was on the mend, and Dr. Carver had made his report to me with the visible pleasure of a man who has witnessed something that impressed him. Miss Hartley's management of the sick room had been, in his considered professional opinion, exemplary. She had identified the correct treatment priorities, maintained appropriate temperatures in a cottage with a failing chimney, kept meticulous records of each patient's condition and response, and had done all of this while being present for 3 consecutive nights without, apparently, sleeping more than a few interrupted hours. Mrs. Aldgate informed me of the return with the expression she was increasingly using, a kind of contained satisfaction, as though she had wagered on something and was watching her investment perform. She said Miss Hartley had asked for a bath and a proper meal and would be perfectly well after some rest. I said thank you, and then sat in my study for an unreasonably long time before I was able to focus on anything useful. At dinner, she looked tired in the way people look tired when they have been useful far beyond their ordinary capacity and have not yet come back to themselves. But she ate with appetite, and her color was returning, and she told me about the Mossfield children with a warmth in her voice I noticed because it was different from her usual tone, still controlled, but warmer, the voice of someone who has had 3 days of closeness and allowed herself to feel what she was close to. And then halfway through the second course, the small notebook appeared. I had not seen the notebook before. It was a small, plain thing, with a dark cover that showed considerable use, and it appeared from somewhere in the vicinity of her left side as naturally as if it had always been there. She placed it on the table beside her plate, uncapped a pencil, and looked at me. "I've been thinking about the estate medical provisions," she said. I looked at the notebook. "If you prefer to discuss it another time," she said. "No," I said, "go on." She had, over 3 days at the Mossfield cottage, evidently done a great deal of thinking between the nursing. She had questions about Dr. Carver's quarterly arrangement. Did it cover tenant visits or only the hall? She had noticed that there was no formal agreement with a district midwife, which meant that the Crenshaw confinement in December depended entirely on an informal arrangement through the village. She wanted to know whether the estate had a fund for tenant emergencies, or whether each situation was handled individually as I saw fit. I answered all 3 questions honestly, which is to say I answered the first with, "I believe only the hall," and the second and third with "no" and "individually," respectively. She wrote things down. She did not say anything that could be construed as criticism. She simply wrote the things down in her small, neat hand, and I sat across the table from her in the candlelight and watched her write, and something shifted in me, something that had been held at a careful remove since October 1st. I was watching a woman who had arrived at this estate as a debt settlement, and had spent 3 weeks running it with more thoroughness and care than I had managed in 3 years. "You will exhaust yourself," I said, "if you continue at this pace." She looked up from the notebook. "I notice," I said more carefully, "that you have been awake for the better part of 4 days. You are clearly still tired, and you are already taking notes about the spring drainage and the midwife arrangement." She looked at the notebook, she looked at me, and then, for the first time, she smiled. Not the small, contained, almost smile I had seen once before, but a real one, quick and warm, reaching her eyes. "Someone has to," she said. "Yes," I said, "but not tonight." She looked at me for a moment, and the smile softened into something I had even less name for, and she closed the notebook. That night I found her in the library. It was past midnight. I did not sleep before 2 as a rule and never had, a habit I had tried to correct and eventually accepted as simply how I was constituted, and I had been in the habit of reading in the library in those hours for years. But the library, when I came down the east corridor, had a light under the door. She was in the window seat. She had pulled a large book from the shelves, a volume of natural history, illustrated with beautiful and somewhat peculiar engravings, and she had it open to a full-page plate of a locust swarm, thousands of them filling the sky above a barren landscape, rendered in extraordinary detail, and she was sitting with her feet tucked under her and her hair loose around her shoulders, reading by the light of a single candle. And she looked entirely at home, in a way that she never quite looked anywhere else in the hall. She heard me come in, and she did not startle. She looked up and said, with complete composure, as though we had arranged this, "I thought you'd be asleep." "I rarely sleep before 2, I said. "Neither do I." She held up the book slightly. "This is a remarkable collection." "Is it your father's?" "My grandfather's, I think. He collected natural history." I came and sat down on the other window seat, across the embrasure from her. "I never read it." "It's extraordinary." She looked at the engraving. "Locusts, can you imagine the whole sky filled with them? The ancient world must have thought it was the end of everything. She looked up at me. "Do you want to read? I promise I won't talk unless you want to." "I find," I said, "that I want to." We talked for 2 hours. We talked in the way people talk at midnight in a library when there is no one to perform for and no table between them and nothing required. And I told her things I had not told anyone. About my father, who had been a man of iron efficiency and no warmth, who had run this estate like a ledger problem and treated his tenants like entries in it, and whose shadow I had been living inside for 15 years without quite knowing how to step out. About the particular loneliness of being the most feared man in 3 counties, which sounds like a complaint of a man with too much and is, but is nonetheless real. About the fact that I had agreed to this arrangement partly because I had stopped expecting warmth and had quietly decided that competence was enough, and that a woman with no warmth to offer and no warmth expected of her was the most honest arrangement available to me. She listened. She did not say anything reassuring or empty. Then she told me about growing up in the Hartley house, about learning early that her father found her difficult, not because she was cruel or disobedient, but because she noticed things, noticed the ledger, noticed the debt, noticed the gap between what was spent and what came in, and he found being noticed by her more uncomfortable than the debts themselves. About being the plain one, the third one, the one who wasn't going to make an advantageous match, and learning to be useful instead because useful was the only currency she had that anyone acknowledged. About packing her one trunk on the morning she left for Ashbourne Hall and not crying, because she had already cried all the tears she had some weeks before when she understood that the contract had been signed without anyone asking her. "Did you want to refuse?" I asked. She considered this with the honest patience she brought to every question. "I thought about it," she said, "but refuse and go where? My father's house is lost regardless. I know the accounts. I knew it would go. My sisters are married and settled. I had no money and no prospects," and she looked at the dark window where the park lay silver with moonlight, "and I thought, at least this is something. At least it is a house and a purpose, and I am better than no purpose." A small pause. "I didn't think it would be this." "What did you think it would be?" I asked. She looked at me steadily. "Colder," she said. The fire had burned very low. The single candle threw long shadows across the shelves, across the engraving of the locust swarm in the open book between us, all those thousands of small things filling the sky. "It was going to be colder," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "I know," she said quietly. "I could tell it was going to be colder." A pause. "I think it stopped being somewhere around the flooded yard." I thought about the yard, about the shovel, about the Crenshaw boy announcing that the Duke was digging, with the solemnity of a 5-year-old reporting an important fact. "The channel needed clearing," I said. "Yes," she said. "It did." She looked at me with something in her expression I was only beginning to learn to read, not quite amusement, not quite affection, something that contained both. "There are a great many things on this estate that need clearing," she said. "I'm making a list." "I know," I said. She smiled. She closed the book. She set it on the window seat, and she tucked her feet further under her and pulled her shawl around her shoulders against the library cold, and she said, "I think I am going to like it here." And I thought I could not say it, not then. I had not yet found the way. I thought, I think I am going to like everything. Part 5. The Supper. The Harvest Supper was a tradition at Ashbourne. Every year, on the last Friday of October, the hall was open to the neighboring gentry for an evening that my father had used to demonstrate the prosperity of the estate, and that I had continued because I had not wanted to deal with the consequences of stopping a 20-year tradition. The neighboring squires and their wives, the minor lords of the surrounding estates, the rector and his family, the physician, the magistrate and his wife. They came every year and ate well and talked at great length about the harvest and the weather and the state of the roads, and went home, and the estate paid for it, and I considered it a functional expense of living in the district. I had not, this year, given much thought to Nell's position at the supper. This was, I recognized afterward, a failure of imagination on my part. I had grown up in these drawing rooms. I had navigated them since boyhood. I understood, at some level I had never needed to make explicit, that they were not kind to women who fell outside the narrow range of what was considered suitable. And Nell, arriving from a debtor's household in last season's gown, without the particular social performance that these evenings required, was going to fall outside that range in ways that I had not thought to prepare for. The guests began arriving at 7. Nell stood at my side in the drawing room to receive them. This was proper, and she did it without being asked, because she understood the estate's obligations even when I had not told her, and she was in her dark blue wool gown, the only evening gown she had brought, and it was well made and respectable and several years behind the fashion, and in a room of silk and figured muslin and jet and gold trim it was quietly, decisively conspicuous. She received each guest with a directness and genuine warmth I had not anticipated. She remembered names, asked questions that showed she had been paying attention to the district since she arrived, made connections with an ease that surprised me repeatedly. The magistrate's wife had a sister in Wiltshire who had known the Hartley family, and Nell remembered the sister and asked after her with an authenticity that was not performance. She genuinely remembered, genuinely wanted to know. Within 10 minutes they were deep in conversation, and the magistrate's wife was laughing at something Nell had said, a real laugh, and I stood 2 feet away thinking, she has managed this drawing room better in 10 minutes than I have in 20 years. But not everyone was the magistrate's wife. Lady Welborn was the wife of the nearest baron, a woman of considerable fashion and considerable unkindness, wielded with the perfect assurance of someone who had been beautiful since birth and had never needed to develop anything else. She arrived late, she always arrived late, as a statement, and she took one long measuring look at Nell across the drawing room and turned to her companion, Mrs. Aldricott, the rector's wife, who was not herself unkind but was weak in the particular way of women who have never found the courage to contradict someone with better jewels, and said something that made Mrs. Aldricott's face go blank, and then assume the uncomfortable arrangement of a woman who knows a cruelty has been committed in front of her, and is wishing she were elsewhere. I was across the room. I could not hear the words. I could hear them 20 minutes later, when the drawing room had settled into its conversational clusters, and Lady Welborn had moved nearer to where I was standing with Sir Herbert Fane. Sir Herbert was a bore and a gossip, and a man who laughed at things he knew were wrong because he had never found a better way to manage discomfort. He and Lady Welborn were talking about the supper, about the harvest, about various neighbors, and then, with the particular carrying quietness of someone who intends to be overheard, Lady Welborn said, "Well, one supposes the Duke of Ashbourne had to settle for something. Though one would have thought he might have found something a pause, exquisitely timed, a little more suited to the hall." Sir Herbert laughed. It was the quick, nervous laugh of a man who knows he is contributing to something rotten and cannot quite stop himself. I turned my head. I looked at Lady Welborn. I looked at her with the particular silence I have spent 20 years developing, the silence that says I have heard you, and I have measured you, and I find the measurement does not favor you. I let it hold for long enough that Sir Herbert stopped laughing, long enough that Lady Welborn understood clearly that she had been heard, long enough for the nearest cluster of people to become very still. Then I crossed the room. Not to Lady Welborn. I crossed the room to where Nell was standing with the magistrate's wife and 2 other women, talking with her back to all of it, entirely unaware. I came to stand beside her, and I waited for a natural pause in the conversation, and then I said, at a perfectly ordinary volume, the words that were true and that I had meant to say privately and now understood I wanted to say here. Mrs. Crenshaw's infant daughter was born safely this morning. I received word from Dr. Carver an hour ago. I thought you would want to know." She turned to me. Her face changed completely freely with a joy she did not contain or moderate. "Oh," she said. "Oh, thank goodness." Her eyes were bright. "And Mrs. Crenshaw, she was having such a difficult time of it in October." "Both well," I said. "Dr. Carver sends his particular compliments to you. He says you identified the concern about the December date early enough to make all the difference." She shook her head. "He is too generous. He did the real work." "He says the same of you," I said. And then I offered her my arm, and I said clearly to the room that was listening, to the drawing room and Sir Herbert and Lady Welborn and the magistrate's wife and everyone, "I would like you to meet my wife properly, for those who have not yet had the chance. She has, in the last 3 weeks, managed the estate's response to a partial crop failure, supervised the drainage repair on 4 tenant holdings, and provided what Dr. Carver is calling the best sickroom management he has encountered in 12 years of practice. I had not anticipated, when I married her, that she would prove indispensable quite so quickly." He said he hadn't meant it as a compliment, but I did. She took my arm. We walked into the dining room. The room followed us. I did not look back at Lady Welborn. At dinner I seated Nell at my right hand. I introduced her when it arose naturally, with the simple honesty of a man who has finally found the words for what is in front of him. I let the magistrate's wife continue the conversation about the drainage repairs. She was genuinely interested, had tenant connections herself, and I watched Nell talk in the warm candle-lit dining room about Mrs. Crenshaw and the midwife arrangement and the spring drainage plans, and I thought, she is not performing. She is simply being what she is. And what she is extraordinary. Lady Welborn said nothing of consequence for the remainder of the evening. After the guests had gone and the hall had settled back into its quiet, I found Nell in the drawing room standing at the dark window. The candles were burning low. She was looking at the park, at the November bare trees, at the stars beyond. She heard me come in. She did not turn. "You heard what she said," she said. "It was not a question." "Yes," I said. "It wasn't the worst thing anyone has said about me," she said, quietly and without bitterness. She said it the way she said everything difficult, straight and clear, without dramatizing it. "No," I said, "but it was the last thing anyone will say about you in this house." She turned then. She looked at me in the last candlelight, and there was something in her face that was not quite gratitude and not quite surprise, but was something more complicated and more tender than either. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I didn't do it because it was correct," I said. "I didn't do it because you were my responsibility or because I was making a point." I looked at her. "I did it because you went into a flooded yard in the cold to make sure 3 children had food, because you stayed up 3 nights with children who were not your children and a woman you had known for 2 weeks. Because you have been running this estate since the day you arrived, with more care than I gave it in 3 years, and you have never once asked to be thanked for it or acknowledged for it or even seen for it." I stopped. I found I was not done, and it seems to me that a woman who does that ought to have someone, at least, at her right hand. She was very still. "That is not a small thing you just said," she said after a moment. "No," I said, "it isn't." Part 6, the morning after. It was the 1st of November when I went to find her. The estate had settled into the quieter rhythm of early winter. The harvest was in, what remained of it. We had compensated the affected tenants fully, and the 4 drainage repairs were completed or in progress, and the village had a formal midwife arrangement in writing for the first time in recorded history, because Nell had written the terms herself and asked me to sign them, and I had signed them without reading them very carefully because I had, by that point, learned that her drafts were better than anything I would have managed. The Mossfield children were fully recovered and had been seen in the village with a vitality suggesting the illness had left no lasting mark. Mrs. Crenshaw's daughter was thriving. The hall itself felt different from the hall I had returned to after the summer. I had not noticed the change happening. I noticed it now. There were flowers in the entrance hall. Not the formal arrangements my mother had kept, not a florist's architecture, but a simple earthenware jar of late autumn branches and a few dried seed heads from the garden, placed on the hall table as though someone had walked in from outside with them because she had liked them and thought they'd look well there. There were books on the side table in the morning room that had not been there before, not books from the library, but books that appeared to have been in someone's possession for years, worn and marked. There was a smell in the kitchen corridor of something baking that the kitchen had not produced since Mrs. Aldgate's predecessor had run it, some 15 years ago. The East Wing guest room had been quietly vacated. I had not been told this. Mrs. Aldgate had not informed me. I noticed it when I passed the corridor and saw that the door stood open to an aired and empty room, and I stood there for a moment and then walked on and did not ask, because I understood without asking what it meant, and I did not want to make her uncomfortable about it. I found her in the estate office. She had moved a small table to the east window, the window that looked out over the south fields, over the land she had been walking since October, and on that table were ledgers in her own hand. She had, I would learn later, been there since before dawn. She was drafting the terms of the midwife arrangement, but she was also, I could see from the open pages, cross-referencing the drainage repair invoices against the estate accounts, tracking the actual expenditure against what I had authorized. In a color-coded system I did not recognize and could see, from the doorway, was considerably more legible than anything my steward had produced. She looked up when I came in. She held the pencil between her fingers in the way of someone interrupted mid-thought. "I know," she said before I could speak. "I should have asked before rearranging the office. I'll move the table back if you prefer." "Don't," I said. She waited. I came and stood in the middle of the office. It was not a large room. The morning light came through the east window onto the ledgers and onto her face, and she looked at me with those clear gray eyes, and I stood there feeling considerably more uncertain than I had felt at any point in my adult life, which is a significant claim in a life that had contained moments of real difficulty. "When your father signed that contract," I said, "the arrangement was a settlement, a debt cleared, a ledger entry. I accepted a wife the way a man accepts a parcel of land when the alternative is pursuing the debt in chancery." I paused. "I want to not undo it. I find I do not wish to undo it, but I want to begin again." She was very still. "Not as a debt in its settlement," I said. "Not as an arrangement," as I stopped, found the words. "As two people who chose each other. Or as a man who has chosen, and who would very much like to know if the woman across the table has any." "Edmund," she said. She said it the same way she had said it on the cottage step at 3:30 in the morning. My name, as simple and direct as everything she did. I stopped talking. "I chose it," she said. "I chose to come here and I chose to stay and I chose." She looked at the ledger and then back at me, and her voice was quiet but entirely steady. "I chose every morning to be present in this house in the way I knew how to be present, even when I didn't know if you wanted that. Because I found, rather against my expectations, that I wanted to." A pause. "That I wanted to be here, with you." I crossed the room. 3 steps. I took her hand. There was ink on her fingers, the dark blue-black of the estate ledger ink, on her index finger and the side of her palm. And I held her ink-stained hand in both of mine, and I looked at her in the morning light and I said, "I have not the faintest idea how to do this." "Neither do I," she said. Her voice was warm and a little uneven. "I think that is quite all right." I pressed her hand. I said, because it was true and because she deserved to hear it said plainly, "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known." She looked at me for a long moment. "You should say so more often," she said, "and not only when you've worked yourself up to it." I laughed. I cannot remember the last time I laughed before that morning, but I laughed then, in the estate office with the winter light coming through the east window, and she looked at me with a smile that was entirely unguarded, and then she said, "You have a great deal to apologize to the tenants for. On behalf of the estate, we should make a proper plan." "Can we make the plan tomorrow?" I said. "Yes," she said, "I think we can," and she did not take her hand back. Part 7. What the account was. I am telling this story in the winter of 1828. We have been married 11 years. There are things about a marriage that can be told, and things that cannot. The things that cannot be told are the better part of it. The long, ordinary days, the evenings by the fire when no one says much of anything and it turns out not to matter, the small moments of being known by someone who has paid attention. Those belong to us and are not for telling. But I can tell you the shape of the 11 years, and I want to, because the shape of them is the point. We repaired the south tenancy drainage fully by the following spring. Nell had, over the winter months, drawn up a comprehensive infrastructure plan for all 4 affected holdings, not just the drainage but the buildings, the road access, the well positions, and presented it to my new steward, who had replaced the old one without acrimony. The new steward was a young man called Hatch who had grown up on tenant land in the district, who understood viscerally what a failed harvest cost a family and what a blocked drainage channel meant for children sleeping above a flooded cellar. He and Nell worked together from the beginning with a mutual efficiency I watched with considerable satisfaction. The midwife arrangement was formalized in February of 1818. Mrs. Pierce, the district midwife Nell had identified and corresponded with before I had been aware any correspondence was happening, attended the Crenshaw confinement in December and the next 14 births on the estate tenancy over the following years. The Crenshaw daughter, born that November evening when Nell's eyes went bright in the drawing room, is 8 years old now. She has, by the occasional report I receive from the tenant community, strong opinions and a way of making them known. Mrs. Aldgate retired in the spring of 1825, 7 years into what she had clearly considered a successful campaign. She attended our eldest daughter's christening in 1820 with the expression of a woman who has placed a bet and watched it come in spectacularly, and was too dignified to be visibly smug about it, and was visibly smug about it anyway. Our children. Clara, who is 8, has her mother's gray eyes and her mother's facility with numbers, and has been found in the estate office studying the ledgers with the focused expression of someone who considers this a natural use of a Tuesday afternoon. Our son William, 6, is serious and outdoors loving and has, to my profound relief, no apparent interest in cards. Our youngest is 4 and is either baffling or profound, and sometimes both at once. Nell runs this estate, not as a courtesy, not as a hobby, but as herself, with full authority, in the way the estate actually requires being run, with attention to the people on it as well as the accounts, with the understanding that a tenancy is made of families and not just land values. The surplus she found in the 1819 accounts had been hidden by a decade of muddled bookkeeping. She found it in 4 weeks, explained it clearly, and suggested 3 ways to deploy it. She was right about all 3. She is known in the district as herself, the woman who appears at a difficult birth at 2 in the morning, who runs the lending library she established in 1821, with the same matter-of-fact thoroughness she brings to everything else. And I am different from the man I was in October 1817. Not reformed exactly, more accurate to say opened. A man closed since his father's time, who discovered in the company of a plain-spoken woman from Wiltshire that he had been wrong about warmth, wrong about its scarcity, wrong about whether he was capable of it. She did not warm me by demanding it. She warmed me by being so entirely and honestly herself that being cold in her company became gradually impossible. I want to tell you about one morning in our second winter together. She was in the early months of her first pregnancy, not unwell exactly, but tired in a way that was new for her, a woman accustomed to being relentlessly capable. She had been sleeping later, which was not her habit, and I had been quietly rearranging my mornings for 2 weeks to cover the estate business she had intended to handle, without telling her this because I knew she would not permit it if I explained it, and I was not above circumventing her on this particular point for her own good, which I was aware was not fully consistent with everything I had said about respecting her authority. But there we were. I was in the estate office one February morning, working through the March rent accounts with more effort than they should have required, when I heard her on the stairs. I knew her step by then. I had learned it without intending to, the particular rhythm of it, the slightly quicker pace when she was on her way somewhere purposeful, and she came into the office wrapped in a heavy shawl and saw me at the ledgers and stopped. "Edmund," she said, "what are you doing?" "The March rents," I said. She looked at the ledger. She looked at me. Her face did the complex thing it did, the thing that was not quite amusement, not quite affection, some combination of both that I had come to love with a specificity that surprised me. "You've put the Mossfield Quarterly in the wrong column again," she said. "I've done it 3 times," I said. She came and sat beside me at the desk. She took the pencil from me. She moved the Mossfield Quarterly to its correct place. Then she set the pencil down and she looked at me and she said, "You've been doing this every morning." "For 3 weeks," I said. "Edmund," her hand came over mine on the desk, her capable ink-stained hand. "You did not have to do this quietly. You only had to ask." "I know," I said, "but I didn't want to ask, I wanted to help." She looked at me for a long time, in the February light through the east window, with the frost still on the south fields beyond the glass. "There it is," she said softly. "What?" I said. "That," she said, "right there, that is what I have been hoping for." I did not ask her to explain. I knew what she meant. She meant the man who picks up a shovel in a flooded yard because there is a woman there working and he wants to be useful. The man who sits on a stone step in the October dark because closeness itself is something. The man who chooses, who stops waiting to be given permission to choose, and does. We did the March rents together. She in the larger chair, me on the edge of it, her hand next to mine on the ledger, moving through the columns with the practiced ease of someone who has done this many times, explaining the system again with more patience than I deserved. Outside the east window, the February fields were silver-white with frost, and the light was pale and clear, and it was one of the ordinary mornings that make up a life and are the better part of it. I accepted Nell Hartley as a settlement. A debt cleared, an account balanced, a practical solution. I did not expect to be known by her. I did not expect her to look at this estate, at the ledgers, the drainage, the tenants, the cold rooms, the man in them, and see the places where I had been absent and care about those places, and address them with steady patience, and without making me feel I ought to be ashamed of having failed them. I did not expect the library at midnight, or the stone step in the October dark, or ink on her fingers in the morning light of the estate office. They called her the plain one. Her father said it without apparent awareness that it was a measure of him, not of her. Lady Welborn implied it across my dining room table and landed, for the target it was aimed at, in empty air. They were wrong, not merely wrong about her face, though they were wrong about that too. Wrong in the more fundamental sense. Wrong about what they were measuring and wrong about what measurement means. She is the most extraordinary person I have ever known. Clear, honest, present, and unafraid. She carried a house that did not value her, and she came to one that had not yet learned to, and she set about being indispensable so quietly that the house changed around her before it knew it was changing, before I knew I was changing. That is the account I did not know I was settling. The debt my estate owed was to the people on it, the Crenshaws and the Mossfields and the 80 tenant families I had been managing at a distance as a ledger problem rather than a human one. And the debt I owed was to myself, to the self that knew warmth was possible and had decided otherwise, which is the most common and least forgivable form of cowardice. She cleared both, without being asked, without ceremony, simply by being here. On the morning of our 11th anniversary, I came downstairs to find her note on the estate office desk. She had been up before me. She was always up before me. This had not changed and would not change, and the ledgers were open at the current page, and she had written in the margin in her small, neat hand, March rents correctly entered. Mossfield in the right column. Below that, breakfast is ready when you are. The children are asking for you. Don't let it get cold. I stood in the estate office in the November morning light, and I read that note, and I thought about £11,000 and a hired carriage, and a woman with one trunk and gray eyes who had arrived at this house and seen the plasterwork cracking above the east window and said so on her first afternoon. I thought Thomas Hartley's worst moment was the best thing that ever happened to this estate, was the best thing that ever happened to me. I folded the note and put it in my coat pocket. Then I went to breakfast. End. Narrated by Edmund Calloway, Duke of Ashbourne, in the winter of 1828.